In the late 1950s, Fidel Castro and his small band of Cuban guerrillas started a revolution that challenged the desire of the United States to control the Western Hemisphere.
We couldn't think about the Cold War at that time. And besides, we were naive. We really believed there was a certain international order. We believed in the existence of certain international principles. We believed that the sovereignty of nations would be respected.
To the United States, Castro's nationalism and left-wing policies were a Trojan horse for Soviet communism.
Up until that time, we had viewed Latin America as a distant, exotic continent with which we had virtually no relations. The Cuban Revolution changed all this.
From its birth in 1776, the United States had grown and grown. Where its flag did not fly, its troops or agents often intervened. In the 1950s, the Guatemalans dared to challenge an American business that controlled much of its economy. The United Fruit Company of Boston owned 500,000 acres of land, the railroad, the port, and telecommunications. But most Guatemalan peasants found it difficult to survive. In 1950, Jacobo Arbenz was voted president. He wasn't a communist, but some of his close allies were. A former military man, Arbenz sought to modernize Guatemala's backward society. Washington was alarmed.
What we were faced here with the obvious intervention of a foreign power, because these homegrown parties are not really homegrown. They're being funded or advised by a foreign power, i.e. the Soviet Union.
Я абсолютно убежден в том, что правительство Арбенса,
the Arbenz government, which had been in power from 1950, didn't enjoy any logistical support from the Soviet Union. We didn't even have diplomatic relations. There was no Soviet mission in Guatemala.
President Arbenz started a land reform program, buying up fallow land to distribute to peasants. In compensation, he offered the landowners the values they had themselves declared for taxes. United Fruit was offered just over $1 million for its land. When Arbenz declared nationalization, the company, backed by the United States, claimed $16 million.
He saw that I didn't look very pleased. He said, "Aren't you happy about the news?" And I replied, "Now we're going to have to fight on two fronts. We're going to have to fight internally against the landowners and also against the United States."
My counterpart, the Guatemala City Chief of Station, was sending in reports too about communist infiltration in the government. And of course he mentioned Jose Manuel Fortuny and some of the old-time Stalinist communists who were gaining favorable positions in the Arbenz regime.
In this impasse, the US named John Purifoy as its new ambassador. Purifoy had had experience of communist efforts to gain power in Greece.
Purifoy said to Arbenz, "Mr. President, we can sort out all this business of the United Fruit Company so that you can come to a satisfactory agreement with them. The United Fruit Company is not the problem. The problem is the communists that you have in your government."
Nada menos que John Foster Dulles, que era el secretario.
No less a figure than John Foster Dulles, head of the State Department, was part of the firm of lawyers acting for the United Fruit Company. His brother Alan was the head of the CIA. So it didn't take much of an effort on their part to persuade their president, a military man, Mr. Eisenhower, to give them the green light to overthrow Arbenz's government.
U.S. Secretary of State Dulles takes the rostrum to urge united action by the Americas to outlaw international communist intervention in the Western Hemisphere.
This conference was shocked by the dastardly attack on members of the United States Congress by those who professed to be patriots. They may not themselves have been communists, but they had been subjected to the inflammatory influence of communism, which avowedly uses extreme nationalism as one of its tools.
Arbenz once again put on his colonel's uniform as Guatemala prepared for war. In Esquipulas, an important religious shrine in a very Catholic country, the church helped organize the opposition to Arbenz. A CIA operation, codenamed PB Success, mobilized disaffected exiles and peasants into action.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II, and just rendered everybody paralyzed.
The UN met in emergency session. Guatemala City was strafed from the air. Rebels invaded from Honduras. The CIA spread panic. Washington denied responsibility.
The information available to the United States thus far strongly suggests that the situation does not involve aggression, but is a revolt of Guatemalans against Guatemalans.
The Soviets were warned.
Stay out of this hemisphere, and don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
The American PB Success campaign brought the government down and drove Arbenz and his wife into exile. 9,000 of his supporters were arrested. Many were kept in jail without trial for years.
They even set up anti-communist committees, where anyone could go and give the names of people who had been loyal to the revolution. These people would then be mercilessly kidnapped, killed, and so on.
Among those who fled was a young Argentine doctor, Ernesto Che Guevara, who went to Mexico and there met Fidel Castro.
I remember my talks with him. He was terribly indignant and embittered by these events, which had interrupted an endeavor which wasn't even radical. It was a relatively simple change, land reform, which was very just and necessary.
5 years later, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara had triumphed. 90 miles from Florida, in what the United States considered its own backyard, Castro established a regime soon to be allied with the Soviet Union.
Let all our neighbors know that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. and let every other power know that this hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house.
In 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy took over the presidency, and with it a CIA scheme to send in an army of exiles to overthrow Castro as they had earlier overthrown Arbenz in Guatemala.
So I was yanked back from Montevideo, where I would have been content to spend the rest of my life, and told that what we're doing is reassembling the PB Success Team, that is the Guatemala operational team, to take care of Castro.
At the Bay of Pigs, Castro's forces routed the CIA-sponsored invasion.
Castro was secure, and he was beloved by millions in Cuba, and so it was a different situation than Guatemala.
Y los gusanos, los privilegiados, los parásitos y los hijos de los parásitos que quieran enarbolar la bandera vergonzosa del crimen y de la traición a la patria, sepan que no se van a enfrentar con señoritos, sepan que se van a enfrentar con hombres.
Castro, triumphant, was eager to take armed revolution into Latin America. To combat the Cuban challenge, the US established in its Panama Canal zone a sophisticated school. Here, counterinsurgency forces from all over the subcontinent were trained. By the early 1960s, left-wing revolutionary groups were fighting the authorities in Guatemala, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and the Dominican Republic.
Marines are ordered into the revolt-torn small island country by President Johnson. 500 Leathernecks are put ashore by helicopter.
In 1965, US Marines went in to crush the Dominicans, who were trying to restore their elected president.
The American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere.
Если Советский Союз,
The Soviet Union, especially after Brezhnev came to power in 1964, adhered to the principle of peaceful coexistence and détente and the relaxation of international tension. But the Cubans had a theory which can be described as, let's have 100 Vietnams.
Che Guevara was behind the call for 100 Vietnams. In 1965, he went to the Congo and later to the heart of South America to spread the cause of violent revolution. By late 1967, US instructors were training Bolivian troops in guerrilla warfare. They set a trap for Che Guevara.
On more than one occasion, he said, "Our last battle is approaching. We have to prepare for it, and we must be very careful not to be taken prisoner, especially the Cubans."
Che Guevara was captured alive. Hours later, he was shot dead. 5 of Guevara's group escaped to the Bolivian capital, La Paz.
When we arrived in La Paz, we managed to make contact with Salvador Allende in Chile. He gave us every kind of help. He mobilized his whole party in order to rescue us.
Chile had been calm in the 1960s. Washington's Alliance for Progress program spent millions of dollars backing Chile's Christian Democrat government. But in 1970, a coalition of the left and the center sought electoral victory. Unidad Popular was led by a doctor, Freemason, and Marxist bon vivant, Senator Salvador Allende.
Allende was depicted and identified with the socialist communist parties, the left, in the midst of the Cold War, and he represented, of course, socialism and Marxism.
Worried that a Marxist would come to power in legitimate elections, US business made its move.
I directed that an approach be made to both the State Department and Mr. Kissinger's office to tell them that we had grave concern over the outlook for ITT's investment, and we were desirous of discussing our thoughts in Washington and willing to assist financially in any government plan to help protect private American investment in Chile.
The CIA was not far behind. General René Schneider, the popular army commander who defended Allende's constitutional rights, had to be removed from his post.
The CIA gave me $250,000 to use right. It was the military we could count on to come and help us maybe get rid of Snyder. That was the key, get rid of Snyder. Well, I couldn't put my office safe because everybody used the safe, so I kept my riding boots. The money was done up in sausages, like, long strips, and I put the money in my riding boot, and no one used it but me.
The CIA money dispatched to oust General Schneider wasn't needed. Other plotters assassinated him. The murder shocked the nation. Moderate politicians rallied to Allende and consolidated his election victory. In the shanty towns of Chile, there were high hopes as the newly elected president set out on reform, without, he hoped, outside interference.
Que los Estados Unidos tienen que respetar el derecho de los pueblos a desarrollar su economía en la forma que necesita o desea.
Allende's first big step, supported by all Chilean political parties, was the nationalization of copper, Chile's biggest industry, still under effective US control.
When Salvador Allende nationalized copper, it wasn't an arbitrary measure. He did it to obtain the resources to alleviate the great poverty in our country.
Aliviar la gran pobreza en nuestro país.
Allende pressed on with what he called his social revolution. School children were given a daily glass of milk. The middle classes were on edge.
The fear was basically what would happen to the people, to the families, to the property, to your farms.
In the Chilean countryside, peasants chanting pro-Cuban slogans began seizing the land.
What happened afterwards confirmed the fears, because the government, on the one hand, started to expropriate land, started to expropriate industry.
Chile's economy was increasingly put under state control. This upset foreign financiers and the World Bank in Washington, which cut off credits.
Chile, of course, is interested in obtaining loans from international organizations where we have a vote. And I indicated that wherever we had a vote, where Chile was involved, that unless there were strong considerations on the other side, that we would vote against them.
In November 1971, Fidel Castro arrived to support Allende's policy of change through the ballot box.
We fully supported his policy. We trained people for his personal security. We were experienced in this because we had had to defend ourselves against those who wanted to destroy us. We told him about this because we thought he had enemies who might try to take his life.
The dangers didn't just come from the right. Castro's Cuban policy of armed revolution found favor with Chile's extreme left, who were hostile to Allende's methods. But most Chileans ignored the call to armed struggle. As inflation mounted, the right attacked economically. CIA money helped pay for Chilean truck owners to bring the country to a standstill. At the UN, Allende accused ITT of trying to provoke a civil war.
Se proponía el estrangulamiento económico, el sabotaje diplomático, el desorden social, crear el pánico en la población para que al ser sobrepasado el gobierno, las Fuerzas Armadas fueran impulsadas a quebrar el régimen democrático e imponer una dictadura.
Moscow was the next stop. There, Allende sought the money he needed to stave off bankruptcy. But the Russians, already spending a fortune to support Cuba, were unimpressed.
We had come to a conclusion. This regime would soon be toppled because they were trying through very democratic means, without the use of arms, to break the resistance of stronger opposition forces.
Santiago, Chile's capital, June 1973. With the government's popularity actually increasing, some frustrated right-wing military officers took to the streets in an attempted coup. As the world's press recorded the failed takeover, Swedish cameraman Leonardo Henriksson, his camera still running, was gunned down and killed. Allende responded by placing greater reliance on the military. General Augusto Pinochet was appointed as his loyal chief of the army. Once again, the truck owners paralyzed the world's longest and thinnest country. Shops closed for lack of goods. Hunger stalked the streets. Middle-class housewives came out to bang their pots and pans in protest. The violent right laid their plots.
Certainly the situation was getting more and more ominous. And then we did have the possibility of learning something about it, not because we were in touch with the coup plotters. We were not.
Just after midday on Tuesday the 11th of September, under orders from General Pinochet, British-made Hunter jets swooped over the Moneda presidential palace, starting fires which were to burn for weeks.
My wife and our children were at the house, and they had a marvelous view of these planes winging over and then dipping down and sending their bombs into the Moneda.
That morning from the Moneda, Allende had broadcast to the nation.
Trabajadores de mi patria, tengo fe en Chile y su destino. Sigan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores!
Hours later, Allende was dead.
He always said that he wouldn't be taken alive, that he would die defending the Constitution. He kept his word.
General Pinochet immediately stamped his mark on the country. In the capital, suspects were rounded up into the National Stadium. Many, like folk singer Victor Jara, were never seen alive again.
I know that he behaved with great moral courage. I know that he was a sort of source of strength to his fellow prisoners. I know that he sang there. I know that they beat him down. I know that they broke his hands or his wrists. And I know that after 2 days, they killed him off.
Muchos no volvieron, tampoco Manuel.
The people he got rid of and shot out of the stadium were all bad people. I mean, he was smart enough to know if he was going to do it, you had to do it complete 100%. You just can't go into it half-assed, and do a little bit here and a little bit there. He went in with a lot of force and did it, and straightened it out.
When he entered the White House in January 1977, Jimmy Carter promised a new U.S. attitude to the rest of the world.
I announced that human rights would be a cornerstone or a foundation of our entire foreign policy. So I officially designated every U.S. ambassador on earth to be my personal human rights representative.
In Nicaragua, U.S. ambassadors were used to a different role. In the 1930s, U.S. Marines had put the tyrant Tacho Somoza in power. More than 40 years later, Nicaragua was still ruled by a Somoza. A politically moderate newspaper owner, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, dared to challenge the dictatorship.
So what happened to this person who wanted freedom? Well, they murdered him. Who murdered him? The Somoza forces.
Chamorro's murder electrified the cowed people of Nicaragua. Somoza declared a state of siege. The US woke up to popular anger against the super-rich family which had been its ally for more than 4 decades.
I have been fighting the East-West ideological war since the inception of Fidel Castro. So we've been under the attack of that Cuban government for almost 18 years.
From the hills, where they had been secretly training for years, guerrillas emerged who proudly bore the name of the 1930s anti-Yankee rebel, Sandino. But in the town of Esteli, Somoza's World War II US tanks carried the day. "2,000 people died in what became a dead city. The Sandinistas regrouped, pitting their rifles against Somoza's might.
El frente está entrando a las ciudades.
The front now entered the cities and knocked on the door of the capital for the first time in its history.
The Sandinistas' will to win triumphed. Managua went mad with joy. Jimmy Carter had left it very late before abandoning the Somozas and accepting the new Sandinista government.
I said to Carter, the United States had to make good the historical damage they had inflicted on our country. Our party hymn still includes the words, Yankee, the enemy of humanity. We said to him that the only way to abolish that line would be for the attitude of the imperialist powers to change throughout the world.
The US would not be lectured to. The tide of conservatism, which was to bring Ronald Reagan to power, was rising. In Nicaragua, Somoza's land was shared out and the family's business monopolies were taken over. Education and healthcare became widely available. But not everyone was happy with the revolution.
All those who didn't agree with the Sandinista policies were subjected to confiscations and imprisonment. Their lives were threatened. Many were murdered just for disagreeing with the Sandinista front. This sort of thing turned many Nicaraguan peasants against the Sandinistas.
In the shadows, opponents of the revolution plotted their revenge. Inexperienced Sandinista guerrillas struggled to run a war-torn country.
What we asked for was weapons so that we could defend ourselves. That's what we asked of the Soviet Union, of the socialist countries of Eastern Europe, of the Algerians, of the Vietnamese.
We sent light weapons, helicopters, armored cars, and other military equipment. There wasn't a large Soviet military presence, but they did have Cuban advisors.
Throughout Central America, protest mounted against right-wing military rule. In El Salvador, the Catholic Church had become a haven for the oppressed. On the concrete steps of the cathedral in San Salvador, the military decreed that demonstrators for human rights should be discouraged. Nothing very new for El Salvador. In a massacre in 1932, the military had killed up to 40,000 people. In 1979, the cameras were on hand to record the color of the blood. Archbishop Oscar Romero was the cautious leader of Salvadorian Catholics. When he spoke out, the reaction from the right was immediate.
During the last months, the letterbox at the seminary where he had his office was full of anonymous letters practically every day, with death squad emblems on them. There was one death squad called the White Hand. There were many letters written on black paper with the white hand saying, "We are going to kill you. We are going to tear you apart."
Todo quedaría resuelto en El Salvador. No habría necesidad de enfrentamientos ni de otras soluciones. La solución es esta: convertirse de corazón todos al Señor.
In March 1980, as he was saying Mass in a private chapel, the Archbishop was murdered by a single assassin's bullet. At his funeral, the military struck again.
I only remember a bomb exploding, and then many shots being fired, and people running in all directions. It was a disaster. People running, knocking each other down, being hit by bullets. Many, many people were killed.
The fact that they had murdered the Archbishop of San Salvador, who was the highest church representative, and that they had no qualms about killing him, made us all feel practically defenseless. We said, either we take the struggle into the open, to the mountains, or they will kill us all here in the city.
On December 3rd, 1980, 3 US nuns and a woman lay worker started the long drive into town from San Salvador's international airport. On the way, they were raped and killed. Their corpses were discovered in a shallow grave. The killings by El Salvador's National Guard prompted President Carter to withdraw aid to the Salvadorian military. But within 6 weeks, Carter had resumed funding an army whose atrocities continued.
Everything consisted of beatings, electric shocks, and rape, and in keeping me naked. As soon as I was taken to the headquarters, I was undressed. My hands and legs were handcuffed. I was blindfolded so that I could not see the faces of my interrogators.
In town, those suspected of being sympathetic to the guerrillas were easy prey for government forces. At night, bodies were dumped on waste ground or left on city streets. Like the Sandinistas in neighboring Nicaragua, the Salvadorian guerrillas wouldn't give up. The war damage was immense. In the United States, the new Reagan administration blamed Cuba and Moscow.
What we are watching is a four-phased operation. Phase one has been completed, the seizure of Nicaragua. Next is El Salvador, to be followed by Honduras and Guatemala. It's clear and explicit in
There
these
is a
documents.
Caribbean domino theory that's unfolding.
Well, I wouldn't call it necessarily a domino theory. I would call it a priority target list, a hit list, if you will, for the ultimate takeover of Central America.
Look, if a Soviet-Cuban master plan had actually existed, we would have won the Cold War. If there had been a master plan. But unfortunately, there was no such plan. Quite the opposite. Cuba's actions conflicted with Soviet interests at that time.
In El Salvador, US military advisors were hard at work bolstering the army against the guerrillas. The Atlacatla Brigade was the crack unit. In 1981, it went on a search and destroy mission in the guerrilla-controlled Morazan province. At about 5 o'clock in the morning of December the 11th, it would go into action near the village of El Mozote. Hundreds of civilians were slaughtered. The US State Department said it could find no evidence of a massacre.
I saw the women clinging to each other, crying and screaming at them not to kill them. I fought for my children. I didn't want to let them go. I said I would die with them, but they wrenched them from my arms. We heard them killing the children. They killed them at night. You could hear the screams for their mamas and papas.
As the Reagan administration moved to shore up the right in El Salvador and bring down the left in Nicaragua, neighboring Honduras became a base for all sorts of US activity. Honduras was the main place where a force was being trained to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. That force was the Contras.
Some of them were former members of the National Guard of Nicaragua. A lot of them were just, you know, peasants from the mountainous areas between Honduras and Nicaragua who've been at war with somebody forever. And in many respects, they were like a bunch of cattle rustlers.
The Contras were funded from Washington. This undeclared war upset the US Congress. An amendment by Representative Boland of Massachusetts curtailed Reagan's funds for arming the Contras.
We are complying with the law, the Boland Amendment, which is the law. We're complying with that fully. And
Does that mean we are not arming or supplying any of the dissidents along the border, the Honduran border?
I am not going to get it. I could not and would not possibly talk about such things.
Washington was planning another small war. On the Caribbean island of Grenada, where the British Queen Elizabeth was still head of state, a left-wing government was using Cuban contractors to build a new tourist airport. The US suspected a strategic motive. In October 1983, when left-wing Prime Minister Maurice Bishop was assassinated by more extreme Marxists, Washington had an invasion plan ready for Reagan's approval.
And at 5:15 this morning, a joint force landed at 2 spots on Grenada. There is now firing and combat going on. There have been casualties.
The United States hadn't bothered to consult the British Queen or Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. It was all over in a few days.
I basically learned about the invasion of Grenada from the president of Honduras, who called me up to say, do you know what's going on? And I said, well, I have an idea, but I don't know for sure. And he said, well, you're invading Grenada. And he said, please tell the troops that when they're finished there to just keep on coming to Nicaragua.
Many welcomed the Americans. Within 6 weeks, their work done and President Reagan's image enhanced, the US troops left. In Nicaragua, Reagan's crusade against the Sandinistas was stepped up.
Sandinistas desperately needed to get hard currency for their exports to pay off their bank loans. So this was a time to put the mines into Corinto. They only got one harbor that counts. And at the same time, make sure we notify Lloyd's of London. The mines have gone in, so hopefully they put pressure on the shipping companies as well to stay out of there. Well, it worked.
Nicaragua's precious stock of oil went up in smoke. The economy was reeling, and all the while, ways had to be found to contain the US-backed Contra invasion. The Sandinistas asked the Soviets for help.
Leaders in Moscow did not want to provoke the United States into giving more military aid to the Contras and to the Honduran government. Therefore, these requests were politely denied every time the Sandinistas brought it up in Moscow.
The Sandinistas, with help from Cuba, vowed to defend their borders and the revolution.
The success of communism in Central America poses the threat that 100 million people from Panama to the open border on our south could come under the control of pro-Soviet regimes.
Angry at Reagan's continued support for the Contra War, the US Congress, again led by Representative Boland, voted in October 1984 to deny them any further assistance.
With the passage of the Boland Amendments, which ultimately prohibited assistance to the Contras, there was nothing more we could do than to bide our time.
To help pay for the continuing bloodshed in Nicaragua, Reagan's men secretly sold arms to Iran. The American dollar and the failures of the armed left crushed Latin American revolutionary dreams.
The United States saw a threat to their interests because they thought it was a communist struggle. They didn't see us as citizens who wanted a democratic country where there was social justice and which offered opportunities to the majority.
The Cold War cost Latin America the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. In Nicaragua alone, 50,000 died in the Sandinista Revolution, and another 50,000 died in the Civil War. It was atrocious.
There were a lot of deaths, a lot of suffering, a lot of refugees, a lot of population movements. On the other hand, I think an equally, if not more compelling case can be made that had we not done something to stop communist regimes from being established in the other Central American countries other than Nicaragua, say that they'd been established in El Salvador and then in Guatemala and possibly even Honduras during the 1980s, if we hadn't taken the steps that we took, I think the immediate suffering could have even been considerably greater.
1990, Sandinista leader Daniel Ortega asks the Nicaraguan people to vote him president. Former US President Jimmy Carter was there to see fair play. Violeta Chamorro, Ortega's opponent, narrowly won a surprise victory. Washington spent nearly $10 million backing her campaign.